It began in the shadows of old New York, a city swelling with money, liquor, and men willing to do everything for both. By 1931, 5 powerful crews carved out pieces of the boroughs and forged an underworld government that would shape the next half-century from the alleys to the boardrooms. Their names became legend: Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo. This is the story of how they rose from prohibition rackets and street wars to rule America's biggest city, how they survived betrayals, investigations, and bloodshed, and how their influence still lingers in quiet corners of New York today. In the years when prohibition kept the streets humming with illicit money, every corner of New York seemed to have someone running a hustle. By the early 1930s, the city's underworld had become a pressure cooker. Every crew wanted a bigger piece, every boss wanted the last word, and the violence that followed transformed backrooms and sidewalks into battlegrounds. The fighting reached its peak in what came to be known as the Castellammarese War, a blood feud between factions led by Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian traditionalist with a taste for rigid hierarchy, and Joe Masseria, an older boss whose grip on the city had started to slip. Their crews stalked one another through Manhattan and Brooklyn, and bodies started piling up so fast that even seasoned detectives felt the strain. When the smoke finally cleared in 1931, Maranzano was the last man standing. He moved quickly, reshaping the scattered Italian-American gangs into something more orderly. He drew lines across the city map and grouped the outfits into 5 organizations that carried the names of their leaders: Maranzano, Profati, Mangano, Luciano, and Galliano. He wanted a structure that mirrored ancient armies and old-world systems, and for a brief moment he had it. But in the shadows stood Charles "Lucky" Luciano, a man who saw the future of organized crime differently. Luciano believed the Mafia could thrive through cooperation rather than constant warfare. After Maranzano was killed later that same year, Luciano took the reins and created something that would define American organized crime for generations. He called it the Commission. It brought the bosses of the 5 New York families together with the heads of the Chicago outfit and the Buffalo Mafia. They met to settle disputes, manage territory, and keep the organization from tearing itself apart again. It was an underworld boardroom, and for decades it worked. Leadership shifted, bosses fell, and the families adopted the names the world knows now: Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese. These were the years when rackets in trucking, the garment district, construction, gambling, loan sharking, and narcotics pulled in staggering profits. From the 1930s through the 1980s, the 5 families operated like a parallel government in New York City. Politicians felt their presence. Union leaders answered to them. Business owners paid them to stay out of trouble. They built an empire hidden in plain sight. And yet, for all that power, their structure remained invisible to the public. Detectives suspected something larger was at play, but no one outside the life could prove it. That changed in 1963 when Joseph Valacchi, a Genovese soldier facing his own demons, sat before a US Senate panel and spoke the words that shattered decades of silence. He described the existence of the 5 families, the Commission, and the internal rules that governed them. His testimony sent shockwaves across the country. But even with the truth laid out under the bright lights of Washington, the machine didn't stop. Arrests came, trials followed, and the government mounted one case after another, yet the families kept operating. Their influence eventually contracted as federal pressure mounted, and younger generations turned away from the life, but they never disappeared. They still exist in the city's background today. The power they once held has thinned, but the structure Luciano built in 1931 continues to cast a long shadow over New York, carried forward by men who remember what their predecessors created and what it once meant to control a city from the inside out. It started with a crew that walked the streets of East Harlem long before anyone used the phrase 5 families. Their story traces back to the Morello Gang, a group built by Giuseppe Morello after he stepped off a ship from Sicily in the early 1890s. He brought his relatives over in 1893, and together they tightened their grip on East Harlem, the Bronx, and pieces of Manhattan. Morello forged a bond with Ignazio Lupo, a Little Italy figure whose reputation for violence earned him the nickname The Wolf. Lupo later married Morello's half-sister, and the two operations merged into a single force that thrived on counterfeiting, extortion, and murder. By the mid-1910s, their dominance met resistance. Across the river, the Brooklyn Camorra, two Neapolitan crews under Pellegrino Morano and Alessandro Valero, had been building their own rackets in drugs, gambling, and prostitution. For a while, the two sides stayed clear of each other. That changed in 1915 when Giosuè Gallucci, known throughout Little Italy as the King, was killed. His gambling operations were suddenly up for grabs, and the Morello gang and the Camorra moved toward them fast. The struggle that followed became known as the Mafia-Camorra War, a months-long series of hits and reprisals that turned restaurants and street corners into ambush sites. In September 1916, Morano arranged what he called a peace meeting. Nicholas Terranova, Morello's half-brother who had taken command of the gang while Morello and Lupo served time for counterfeiting, arrived expecting a negotiation. Instead, he walked into a setup. Camorra gunmen murdered him before he reached the table. The authorities charged Morano with the killing the following year. More arrests followed, and as one Camorra member after another was sent away, the Brooklyn faction collapsed. The war ended with the Morellos still standing. Then came Prohibition, and with it, an ocean of money. The Morello remnants moved into bootlegging. Power shifted again when Giuseppe Joe Masseria and Rocco Valenti started fighting for control of the gang. After a series of street attacks left Valenti dead, Masseria emerged as the new boss. Under him, the operation grew. He widened its bootlegging, extortion, loan sharking, and gambling enterprises. And he surrounded himself with young talent, men like Charles Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Joey Adonis, and Albert Anastasia. But Masseria had enemies, and the biggest stood with the Castellammarese clan, led by Salvatore Maranzano. Tension built through the 1920s until it erupted into the Castellammarese War, a conflict Masseria seemed destined to lose. Luciano saw the moment as a chance to rise. He made a quiet arrangement with Maranzano, remove Masseria, and earn a place beside the Sicilian boss. Masseria got word that Luciano was plotting against him and tried to have him killed. Luciano received an early warning and lived through the attempt. On April 15, 1931, Luciano invited Masseria to a card game on Coney Island. At the right moment, he excused himself, walked out of the room, and left Masseria at the table. Seconds later, 4 gunmen, Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Joey Adonis, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, rushed in and shot Masseria to death. With that, Luciano stepped into the top position. Maranzano immediately tried to reshape the city's underworld. He called together the leading bosses and declared himself Capo di tutti I capi, the boss of all bosses. He reorganized New York into 5 groups headed by Luciano, Giuseppe Profaci, Tommy Galliano, Vincent Mangano, and Maranzano himself. But Maranzano's appetite for control overshadowed the cooperation he claimed to want, and Luciano saw in him the same ambition that had doomed Masseria. Maranzano sensed the threat and hired Vincent Mad Dog Coll, an Irish gunman, to take Luciano out. Once again, Luciano caught wind of the plot. When Maranzano summoned him to his office in September 1931, Luciano stayed away and arranged his own strike instead. With help from Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky, he recruited 4 Jewish gangsters who posed as government agents, walked into Maranzano's office, and killed him. Luciano became the strongest figure in New York, though he avoided claiming absolute authority. Instead, he built a system he believed could keep the peace. He formed the Commission, a council of bosses from the 5 families, along with Al Capone from Chicago and Stefano Magaddino from Buffalo. It served as a board that managed disputes and shared interests, and it allowed Luciano to guide the underworld without drawing the kind of attention that destroyed his predecessors. In 1935, a new threat appeared when Dutch Schultz, a volatile New York mobster, planned to murder prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey. Schultz saw Dewey as the greatest danger to his operations. Luciano and the Commission saw Schultz's plan as an invitation for a law enforcement crackdown. They met, talked it through, and ordered Schultz removed before he reached Dewey. Schultz was shot to pieces in a restaurant that October. Dewey survived, and for a moment the Commission believed the city's attention would move elsewhere. Instead, Dewey built a case against Luciano himself. In May 1936, he charged Luciano with running a prostitution ring. A month later, Luciano was convicted on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution and sentenced to 50 years. His influence didn't disappear entirely. During World War II, he offered intelligence to federal agents concerned about sabotage in New York's docks. The arrangement led to his release in 1946 and prompt deportation to Italy, where he lived until his death in 1962. While Luciano sat in prison, Frank Costello ran the family. When Luciano was deported, Costello became boss. His decision to demote Vito Genovese from underboss to capo regime created a quiet but determined enemy. Genovese had fled to Italy after facing a murder charge, and when he was finally cleared, he returned to New York ready to reclaim the power he believed he deserved. In May 1957, Vincent the Chin Gigante stepped out of a car and fired at Costello in the street. The bullet grazed Costello's head and stopped short of killing him. At nearly the same time, Albert Anastasia, boss of the Mangano family, was shot dead in a Manhattan barbershop, opening the door for Carlo Gambino to take control. Costello, shaken and sensing what waited for him, stepped aside and allowed Genovese to take over. The organization adopted Genovese's name. Genovese rose fast and became the most dominant mob figure in New York until 1959, when he was convicted on narcotics charges and sentenced to 15 years. That same year, a soldier under his command, Joe Valachi, was arrested and received a similar sentence. Valachi broke under pressure and chose to cooperate. His testimony in the early 1960s confirmed publicly, for the first time, the existence and structure of the Mafia in New York. After Genovese died in 1969, leadership fell to Philip Benny Squint Lombardo, then Vincent the Chin Gigante, and later Liborio Barney Bellomo, each holding the reins at different points, with acting bosses stepping in whenever indictments or internal pressure demanded it. Through all those transitions, the Genovese family maintained the quiet discipline and careful management that began decades earlier in the streets of East Harlem, when Giuseppe Morello was building a foundation that would shape organized crime in New York for generations. The story of the Gambino family begins in the same neighborhoods where the Morellos first carved out their foothold. Ignazio Lupo, the man everyone called Lupo the Wolf, built the crew that would someday carry the Gambino name. His partnership with Giuseppe Morello in the early 1900s expanded his reach across Little Italy. The marriage to Morello's half-sister tightened the alliance even further. Together, their operations tapped into counterfeiting, extortion, and the type of violence that kept the streets whispering their names. When Lupo went to prison for counterfeiting in 1910, Salvatore Toto D'Aquila stepped in. D'Aquila was ambitious and kept pulling new men under his wing, and for a while he looked like he might surpass every other boss in New York. That changed the moment he clashed with Joe Masseria, who had risen to lead the Morello organization. Rumors spread fast in those days, and many believed D'Aquila's downfall came from inside his own camp. His underboss, Alfred Mineo, was thought to have helped set him up. On October 10, 1928, gunmen cut D'Aquila down on a Manhattan street. What followed looked a lot like a quiet coup. Mineo aligned himself with Masseria, thinking it would keep him alive. It didn't. By November 1930, the Castellammarese War was burning through the city. Mineo died during an attempted hit meant for Masseria. Frank Scalise took control of the crew and defected to Salvatore Maranzano's side. Soon after, Masseria fell, Maranzano fell, and the new order took shape. New York now had 5 families, each with a seat at the table. The crew that had started with Lupo became known as the Mangano family once Luciano stepped in and replaced Scalise with Vincent Mangano as boss. But it was Mangano's underboss who cast the longest shadow. Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, operated Murder Inc., a group of hitmen behind an astonishing number of killings in the 1930s. He used fear the way other men used leverage, and he tightened his grip on the waterfronts in Manhattan and Brooklyn. Mangano watched Anastasia grow stronger and saw the danger in his friendship with Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello. At some point, Vincent Mangano vanished. Whether Anastasia pulled the trigger or ordered the job, the message was clear. Costello backed Anastasia and the commission supported the move, hoping to avoid another round of violence. But Anastasia had a habit of drawing attention. When he allegedly ordered the killing of Arnold Schuster, a civilian who had captured headlines for identifying a bank robber, he crossed a line the Mafia tried to keep intact. That kind of murder brought investigators onto doorsteps. Vito Genovese and Meyer Lansky knew Anastasia's volatility could jeopardize everything they were building. They made their preparations. Carlo Gambino was waiting in the wings. Anastasia's murder in a Brooklyn barbershop in 1957 opened the door for him. Once Gambino stepped in as boss, the family adopted his name. Where Anastasia had leaned on pure violence, Gambino built quietly. He kept his profile low, sidestepped prison entirely during his reign, and widened the family's grip on unions and construction. His son married Tommy Lucchese's daughter, creating a powerful alliance. And every plot against him dissolved before it reached his table. Gambino believed he secured the family's future when he appointed Paul Castellano as his successor in 1976. But inside the family, resentment simmered. Some felt that Agnello Della Croce, Gambino's long-standing underboss, had earned the job. Della Croce stayed loyal, but his followers, especially his protege John Gotti, saw Castellano as unworthy. Castellano ruled from a distance, keeping to himself in his Staten Island home and relying on men like Roy DeMeo to maintain order. His detached style bred frustration. Gotti watched Castellano's missteps and built support among soldiers who felt ignored. On December 16, 1985, the tension reached its breaking point. Castellano stepped out of a car outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. Gunmen closed in and shot him in the street. 1 month later, John Gotti claimed control of the family. He became the most public mob boss New York had ever seen. Reporters caught photos of him in tailored suits, smiling outside courthouses. Magazine covers called him the Dapper Don. When prosecutors failed to convict him in case after case, he picked up another name, the Teflon Don. Behind the scenes, federal agents built a stronger case. They planted microphones, flipped witnesses, and eventually persuaded Gotti's own underboss, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, to testify. Gravano delivered a detailed account of murders and rackets. In 1992, Gotti was convicted on charges that included murder and racketeering. He died of cancer in federal custody 10 years later. The Gambino family struggled to regain stability after Gotti fell. His son, John Gotti Jr., stepped in as acting boss before his own prison sentence in 1999. Peter Gotti, John's older brother, took over the family next, but he lacked the presence and influence required to keep the organization steady. Prosecutors nicknamed him the dumbest Don, and he too was convicted of racketeering in 2003. Since then, leadership has shifted several times, each transition marked by federal pressure and internal uncertainty, a far cry from the steady hand Carlo Gambino once brought to the family that now bears his name. The Lucchese family came together later than the Genovese or the Gambino clans, but its beginnings still trace back to the same streets and the same shifting loyalties. The group that would one day carry the Lucchese name started as an offshoot of the Morello gang, though it didn't take its true shape until the 1920s. Its first boss, Gaetano "Tommy" Rayner, operated mainly in the Bronx and parts of East Harlem. He kept a steady hold on the icebox trade, a business that touched every household in those years before modern refrigeration, and he kept a calm, orderly crew around him. When Prohibition began, Reina leaned into his friendship with Joe Masseria. The relationship held until the Castellammarese War loomed. Masseria wanted a portion of Reina's bootlegging profits. Reina refused and moved quietly toward an alliance with Salvatore Maranzano. Masseria sensed the shift. He sent a message to Reina's lieutenant, Tommy Galliano, and asked him to take out his own boss. Galliano pulled the trigger, expecting that Masseria would reward him with leadership. Instead, Masseria placed Joseph "Fat Joe" Pinzolo at the top of the family. Galliano recognized the slight, and he wasn't alone. Tommy Lucchese, another ambitious figure in the crew, sided with him. Together, they arranged Pinzolo's murder in September 1930. Months later, in April 1931, Masseria was killed on Coney Island. With the old boss out of the way, Galliano finally moved into the position he'd been denied. Maranzano reorganized the New York Mafia shortly afterward, shaping it into the 5 families. He left Galliano in charge of Reina's old crew and kept Lucchese at his side as underboss. When Luciano later had Maranzano killed and introduced the commission, Galliano kept his place once again. Unlike other bosses who burned bright and died fast, Galliano lived quietly and stayed out of sight. Lucchese handled the street work. Galliano sent word from the background. Their pairing defined the family for nearly 20 years. Little is known about Galliano's inner workings during those decades. He died in 1951, still securely in charge. Lucchese stepped up naturally. The transition barely rippled the surface. Lucchese believed in the same low-profile approach and maintained the same careful discipline. It paid off. He built political connections, even earning the trust of 2 New York mayors. He kept his hands off the street violence and delegated the rougher business to people who understood how to stay unnoticed. Behind the scenes, Lucchese helped Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino maneuver into power. He played a part in the downfall of Frank Costello and Albert Anastasia, and the alliance between Lucchese, Gambino, and Genovese shaped the commission in the 1950s. Then came the Appalachian Meeting, an event Genovese believed would cement his influence. He chose the rural home of Joseph "Joe" the Barber, Barbara, as the setting. Dozens of bosses arrived in freshly purchased Cadillacs lining the roads around the property. Detective Edgar Croswell noticed the sudden appearance of out-of-state luxury cars. When he learned Barbara had ordered 200 pounds of meat, he knew something strange was taking place. Croswell moved in quietly. He gathered other officers, blocked the roads near the estate, and waited. Inside the property, more than 100 mobsters sensed trouble and bolted in every direction, through woods, across fields, anywhere they could run. Some made it out, most didn't. Genovese tried to talk his way past the officers, and though he wasn't held, the damage was done. His credibility crashed. The embarrassment weakened his standing so thoroughly that Lucchese, Luciano, Costello, and Meyer Lansky devised a plan that would later lead to Genovese's arrest on drug charges. With Genovese out of the way, the commission settled into a rhythm under Gambino and Lucchese. Their bond grew stronger when their children married. Their stability faced one major threat when Joseph Bonanno and Joseph Magliocco conspired to kill them both. They hired Joe Colombo to carry out the murders. Colombo walked the plan straight to Lucchese and Gambino. Bonanno was stripped of his position and allowed to retire, a rare ending for a man who had once been one of New York's strongest bosses. Lucchese continued to run the family until illness overtook him. Before he died on July 13, 1967, he chose Anthony Corallo as his successor. Corallo was serving a short sentence at the time, so Carmine Tramunti stepped in as acting boss. Tramunti lacked the quiet precision of his predecessors. He drew attention, faced repeated charges, and was eventually incarcerated in 1974. By then, Corallo was free and ready to lead. Corallo avoided office meetings. He preferred talking business from a Jaguar equipped with a car phone, a habit that proved fatal to his career. FBI agents planted a bug in the vehicle and recorded hours of conversations involving racketeering, drug deals, and murders. Those tapes became central evidence in the Mafia Commission trial in 1986. Knowing he would never breathe free air again, Corallo appointed Vittorio Vic Amuso as the next boss. Amuso selected Anthony Gaspipe Casso as his underboss. Casso had a reputation soaked in blood. Some believed he had been involved in up to 100 killings. Together, Amuso and Casso ruled through fear, even reopening old hostilities. They targeted John Gotti and Frank DeCicco for Castellano's murder, but only DeCicco died in the retaliation. When authorities closed in during the early 1990s, Amuso and Casso took different paths. Amuso kept silent. Casso broke fast. He told investigators everything he knew and even revealed that 2 NYPD detectives had been working as hitmen for him in the 1980s. Amuso received a life sentence and remains the family's official boss even now. The years that followed brought acting bosses, internal reshuffling, and a wave of arrests. Yet the organization still survives in the background, tied together by the quiet patterns Galliano and Lucchese established long before their names became part of New York's criminal history. When the 5 families first took shape, the organization we now call the Bonannos carried a different name and answered to a different man. Salvatore Maranzano had led the Castellammarese clan through the bloody war that bore his town's name. And when the fighting ended in 1931, he sat at the top of the city's underworld. His reign was brief. Luciano's men killed him within months, and Lucky rewarded Joseph Bonanno, a trusted young Castellammarese lieutenant, with control of Maranzano's organization. Bonanno's roots reached deep into Sicily. His father, Salvatore, and his uncles had long-standing ties to the criminal world around Castellammarese del Golfo, where families like the Magadinos held sway. Stefano Magadino, known later as the Undertaker, had traveled to New York in 1902 and joined the Castellammarese crew before fleeing to Buffalo after a spate of murders made the city too dangerous for him. Bonanno's father returned to Italy in 1911, and with those older figures gone, Niccolo Cola Schirò took charge of the clan. As the Castellammarese War erupted in 1930, Maranzano replaced Schirò and became the dominant Castellammarese figure. Bonanno had risen in his ranks, earning respect alongside Carmine Galante. When Maranzano divided the city into 5 distinct families and named himself Capo di tutti I capi, Bonanno watched the tension between Maranzano and Luciano grow. Once Maranzano was gone, Luciano elevated Bonanno to boss. Bonanno was only 26. He became the youngest mafia leader in the United States, yet he carried the traditions of the old world with him. He kept his inner circle tight, drawing mainly from families tied to his hometown. That homogeneity created a bond that strengthened his family's position. On the commission, he held influence partly due to his close relationship with Joe Profassi, who ran another of the 5 families. Their alliance ran deeper than business. Bonanno's son married Profassi's niece, echoing the kind of strategic family ties that linked the Gambinos and Luccheses. For a time, that unity kept the commission stable and controlled ongoing disputes. But Profassi died in 1962, and the balance he provided died with him. Bonanno felt exposed. Facing men like Gambino, Lucchese, Magadino, and Frank DeSimone in Los Angeles, he decided to strike first. He and Joseph Magliocco, Profassi's successor, planned assassinations that would remove the bosses they believed threatened them most. Magliocco turned to a rising figure in his own family, Joseph Colombo, and asked him to carry out 2 of the murders. Colombo sensed opportunity. He warned Lucchese and Gambino about the plot. The commission summoned both Bonanno and Magliocco. Bonanno believed he wouldn't walk out of the meeting alive. Before he could be taken, he fled to Canada. Magliocco confessed his role. His punishment was limited to exile from leadership due to his failing health. Colombo, in exchange for the information he provided, received control of the family that would soon bear his name. Bonanno still faced legal problems. Eventually, he returned to New York in October 1964 to testify before a grand jury. But he never made it to the courthouse. Somewhere in Manhattan, he disappeared. When he resurfaced in 1966, he claimed he'd been abducted by men loyal to Magadino. His absence shook his family. His son, Salvatore "Bill" Bonanno, claimed leadership, but not everyone accepted it. Gaspar di Gregorio put forward his own claim. The dispute split the family and set off a violent internal conflict that reporters came to call the Bonanno War. Gunfire claimed more than a dozen lives. The war finally stopped in 1968 after Joseph Bonanno suffered a heart attack, and the commission decided it was time to remove him altogether. They granted him an unusual privilege: retirement. Bill stepped down as well. They left New York for Arizona and exited the life. The commission appointed Paul Sciacca to lead the family. His rule didn't last long. Natale "Joe Diamonds" Evola followed him, though he died in 1973. Philip "Rusty" Rastelli then stepped in, only to be convicted of extortion in 1976 and sent to federal prison. That same year, an undercover FBI agent named Joseph Pistone stepped inside the Bonanno family under the alias Donnie Brasco. For 6 years, he lived among them, earning trust, passing tests, and gathering evidence. His work eventually led to more than 100 convictions. The commission saw Pistone's infiltration as a humiliation and punished the family by stripping them of their commission seat. While Rastelli remained behind bars, Carmine Galante rose to power. Galante, the heroin don, moved aggressively to seize narcotics profits. His ambition rattled the city's other bosses. Rastelli and Joseph Massino sought permission for his removal. The commission agreed. On July 12, 1979, gunmen shot Galante to death in a Brooklyn restaurant. A cigar stayed lodged between his teeth when he hit the ground, an image that still circulates today. Rastelli lived until 1991, and when he died, Massino took full control. Massino rebuilt the family's credibility and regained their commission seat. He also took measures to reduce exposure. He closed social clubs and cut joint business with the other families, believing isolation would keep the Bonannos safe. But the strategy only carried him so far. In 2004, after a conviction involving 7 murders put him within reach of the death penalty, Massino became the first sitting boss of a New York family to cooperate with the government. He described his authority, explaining that he approved murders, promoted captains, and decided who could be broken down or elevated. He outlined the old rules, never talking cars, houses, clubs, or on phones. Then he entered witness protection. The family wobbled again. Vincent Bastiano took over, but he too was arrested, and acting bosses rotated through the chair. Stability returned only slightly when Michael Mancuso was named official boss in 2013. Mancuso has spent much of his reign in federal custody, yet he still holds the title. A reminder that the Bonanno family, despite a century of betrayals, exiles, and internal wars, continues to exist in the quiet spaces of New York's underworld. The Colombo family was the last of the 5 families to take shape, and compared to the others, it arrived late to the stage. The year was 1928 when Joe Profassi, a Sicilian immigrant with a warm handshake and a calculating mind, assembled a bootlegging crew that grew steadily into a formidable organization. Profassi kept a firm grip on his men. He understood charm, but he understood leverage even better. For nearly 30 years, he held the reins. His family didn't always move in lockstep. The first cracks appeared in 1959 when Joseph "Crazy Joe" Gallo decided he'd had enough of Profassi's rules. Gallo had a reputation for unpredictability, the kind of man who could stroll the streets of Brooklyn with a pet lion and smile like it was the most natural thing in the world. His rebellion sparked a brief internal war. It ended only because Gallo landed in prison and Profassi died of cancer in 1962. Joseph Magliocco took over next. He was Profassi's brother-in-law, a man who had been comfortable working in his shadow. His time at the top evaporated when he aligned himself with Joseph Bonanno in a conspiracy to kill Gambino, Lucchese, Magaddino, and Frank De Simone. When the plot unraveled, Magliocco surrendered his position. Joseph Colombo, the man who had exposed the conspiracy, was rewarded with leadership of the family that soon adopted his name. Colombo wanted influence beyond street corners and rackets. In 1970, he founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League and positioned himself as a public advocate for his community. Thousands flocked to his rallies. His men watched with growing unease. Public crusades and television cameras were not part of their world, and the other bosses refused to let their members participate, fearing the noise would shake loose the wrong kind of attention. Then Joe Gallo walked out of prison. He was still ambitious, still restless, and saw the wounded family as an opportunity. In June 1971, while Colombo stood at a rally for his league, a gunman stepped out of the crowd and shot him. Colombo survived but was paralyzed. The family needed someone else at the helm. Less than a year later, Gallo was gunned down in a Little Italy restaurant, ending his return as violently as his rebellion years earlier. In the wake of these killings, Carmine Persico rose to power. He became the official boss in 1973 and held the title for 46 years. During that time, he spent all but 3 of those years behind bars. Acting bosses came and went as Persico tried to steer the family from a prison cell. One of those acting bosses was Victor Orena. In 1987, he took charge. By 1991, he wanted more. He made a move for total control, splitting the family into 2 warring factions. Bullets flew across Brooklyn. Cars burned. Bodies disappeared. For 2 years, the Colombo family tore itself apart. More than 24 men were killed or vanished. Orena was eventually arrested and sentenced to life for murder and racketeering. The faction loyal to Persico held onto the organization, but the damage was severe. By the mid-1990s, the Colombo family had thinned to roughly 75 members, crippled by prison sentences and internal bloodshed. Persico kept the boss's title until his death in 2019. Leadership passed to his cousin, Andrew "Andy Mush" Russo, a man with deep roots and old loyalties. Russo died in 2022. Since then, no official boss has been publicly identified. The Colombo family remains the smallest and most battered of the 5 families, still standing but forever shaped by internal wars and the ghosts of ambitions that turn their own men against one another.